hand? Jesus hold my hand. We have PowerPoint for that? Jesus hold my hand? What? Like, as I travel through this pilgrim land, do you bring along with me? Well, that should be in the songbook. As I travel through this pilgrim land, there is a friend who walks with me. Leads me safely through the singing sand. It is the Christ of Calvary. This would be my prayer to Lord each day, to help me do the best I can. For I need thy light to guide me day and night. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. I need every hour. Through this land is pilgrim land, protect me by thy saving power. Hear my plea, oh Lord, dear Lord, come down on me. When I need in prayer, I come to meet you there. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. When I wander through the valley, dim toward the setting of the sun, lead me safely to the land of rest. If I a crown of life have won, I have put my faith in thee, dear Lord, to help me reach the golden strand. There's no other friend on whom I can depend. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. I guess I need every hour. Through this blessed pilgrim land, protect me by thy saving power. Hear my plea, oh Lord, dear Lord, come down on me. When I'm willing high, I feel in prayer. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Any other songs that y'all want to lead that we lead? I think we got plenty of time for you. One more. You've heard that as a dealer.
Someday.
We're doing well. You're doing.
Someday.
I'll sub that in for making the cut. Making the cut. All tonight. 6 meters. Oh, I'm afraid they'll also do these guys before we start. We'll figure out the support. Alright. I think we'll cover the other stuff that y'all wanted to say. I tried to speak in all the requests that y'all made into the PowerPoint. So. Everyone needs compassion, a love that's never failing. Let mercy fall on me. Everyone needs forgiveness, the kindness of the Savior, the hope of nations. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. So take me as my me, all my fears and failures. Fill my life again. I give my life to follow everything I believe in. Now I surrender. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation.
race is intended to actually swing this. So someone fill in the last round. Plus,
He asked if we were to skip it.
I'll just skip it. It was specially requested. I would feel bad. 5. Group 1, Group 2, Group 3. Fill in the gaps. Father, I adore you, and I lay my life before you. Oh, and my life before you. Jesus, I adore you, and I lay my life before you. Oh, and I before you. Spirit, I adore you, and I lay my life before you. And I how deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretched treasure. How great the pain of searing loss! The Father turns His face away, as wounds which mark the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon the cross, my sin upon His shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice called out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there, until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: His wounds have made my ransom. How do you explain? No, how do you describe? The blood that goes from east to west and runs as deep as it is wide. You know all our hope. So listen to our heart, please listen. Hear our spirit sing. A song of praise that's simple song of praise. Those you have redeemed. We will use the words we know to tell you what an awesome God you are. The words are not enough to tell us of our love. So listen to our hearts. Words could fall like rain. Words could fall like rain. From these lips of mine. From these lips of mine. And if I had 1,000 years, Lord, I would still run out of time. If you listen to my heart. Listen to my heart. And every beat will say. Every beat will say. Thank you for the light. Thank you for the truth. And thank you for the way. So listen to our heart. Lord, please listen. Hear our spirit sing. Hear us sing. A song of praise that's simple song of praise. Those you have redeemed. Those you have redeemed. And we will use the words we know to tell you what an awesome God you are. But words are not enough to tell you our love. So listen to our hearts. After this will be you, sir. You are my strength when I am weak. You are the treasure that I seek. You are my all in all. Seeking you as a precious jewel, but to give up I'd be a fool. You are my all in all. Jesus, my sin, my fault, my shame, Christ God in I bless your name. You are my all in all. When I fall down, you pick me up. When I am tired, you fill my cup. You are my all in all. You are my strength when I am weak. You are the treasure that I seek. You are my all in all. Seeking you as a precious lamb, but to give up I'd be a fool. You are my all in all. Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your name.
All right, the coveted after lunch spot. Yeah, it's always, hey, I'm like Ezekiel. I've sat where they sat. I know what that's like to try to get through the lesson after you eat, and it's not always easy to stay awake. I understand that. So, but we're talking about Esther. I'll get out some of my Faulkner University chapstick. You're welcome, Victoria. Thank you for that. We're talking about Esther. The theme, of course, is whatever my lot. Psalm 37, verse 25 says there, David speaking, writing. He says, I've been young And now I'm old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. I think kind of a New Testament equivalent of that. In fact, you may want to write a cross-reference, very similar thoughts expressed in the New Testament by the Son of God himself. Jesus in Matthew 6:33 says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." And these things there, of course, in the context referring to the material needs of life. I want to start off by saying, not necessarily anything to do with Esther here, but whatever my lot, whatever your lot, I know that whether peace like a river attends my way or sorrows like sea billows roll, that God is in control and he's going to take care of me. He's not promised that everything's going to be great in life. We sometimes expect things from God that he hasn't promised. And sometimes when something in life happens that disappoints us, it brings us sorrow and difficulty. We can sometimes get angry with God and upset with God as if he had promised us something that in reality never promised us. God never said that everything's going to be roses, a rose garden, as we sometimes say here on this earth. But he's promised if we serve him faithfully that we have heaven as our eternal home, our eternal hope, and that there'll be no sorrow, no pain, no suffering, no death. We're talking about, in this particular lesson, Esther. I want to give you kind of a rundown of Esther, kind of a summation of all the events, and realizing that we're limited in our time, so I want to do that, but also want to leave time to cover a few important points. But I also want you to understand that the things that we're talking about today, whether it's Paul or Joseph, or as we're talking about in this hour, Esther, these are not things that happened in a vacuum. These happened within events of world history. And you need to understand that. In fact, I've told the congregation at Bremen before, and I've said it in other places, that, and I'm not blaming this on preachers or youth ministers or whatever, when I was growing up, because I probably just didn't listen. They probably tried to teach me and I just wasn't listening. But I didn't realize until like my first, maybe second year of preaching school, the connection that some of these things in the Bible had with like real world events. And we sometimes talk about things in the Bible and we'll say, well, do you know the story of Joseph? Do you know the story of Esther? Do you know the story of Jonah? And on we go with different Bible accounts. And I've even heard some preachers say, don't call them stories. Well, I don't like that because, sometimes we even say, if somebody's being dishonest, we say, well, he told a story, implying he told a lie. Well, I say don't tarnish the word story and call a lie, and just, but yeah, you get the idea. Sometimes if we say stories, we start thinking about fairy tales or something like that. And if we're not careful, we have, a set of stories over here about the Bible, and then over here is world history. And what we forget is that, history, as has often been pointed out, it's not original with me, but history is in reality his story. It's all about God, and really it's all about Jesus. It's God working to bring in the Messiah. But perhaps you may be familiar, to give you just a little bit of background here for Esther. Has anybody ever heard, just raise your hand if, and I know some of you younger kids may not be familiar, you might be, Leonidas. Does that name ring a bell with anybody? Leonidas, okay, few. Sparta, Spartans, and if you ever study your world history or Western civilization, you're going to study about Sparta and these Greek city-states, and they were fiercely independent, but they also would cooperate sometimes, and of course it's going to give way eventually to the great Grecian Empire run by Alexander the Great. But Leonidas and some of those type folks there's some of the background here for the book of Esther, because you get to the book of Esther, and before we're ever even introduced to this young lady named Esther, we learn about this king, and in the Bible, he's referred to as Ahasuerus. And it's probably a transliteration attempt to kind of write it out as it was pronounced in one of the languages. But all that just to say this, in secular history, we recognize him as Xerxes. And I don't know, I meant to look and see, and I forgot. Some translations even may have that, or maybe it's a footnote or something. But I want to say, I also didn't write down the exact date. I think it was around 480-ish BC. Xerxes is remembered for amassing this, one of the largest, in fact, the Greek historian Herodotus tells us that it was the largest force that ever marched forth into one battle. Xerxes was determined he is going to conquer Greece, particularly Athens, but he wants to, conquer all of Greece. And so he goes, and Herodotus says in his writings that he had 2 million troops. I say Herodotus says that because most historians now say that he grossly overestimated the size of that army. Some people have done the research, and there are other historians that were concurrent that they actually give different numbers even between themselves. So nobody really knows, but most people estimate probably at least upwards of 100,000 soldiers. That is a massive amount. I mean, you picture, I don't know what stadiums hold, but I'm thinking a college football stadium. Johnny's a Georgia fan. What does Georgia Stadium hold? Is it close to 100,000? Isn't there one in college football that hold? Is it Michigan Stadium that'll hold like 100,000? It's amazing. So you picture that stadium full of people. You get them all in formations, ranks, and say we're going to march forth. And I mean that's a lot of people. That is a huge force. And so they go and they're gonna conquer Greece. This is Xerxes' mission because I mean it's just what some of these people did. These are heathen kings, and they're self-serving, and it's all just for their own glory. So they want to go and conquer this nation. And his father had set out to do it and hadn't done it, so he wants to kind of finish what dad started. So he goes with this massive force, probably the largest force ever. And they go, but they've got to go. And Xerxes was a very temperamental person. I mean, if you ever study about Nebuchadnezzar, you know Nebuchadnezzar was pretty temperamental too, right? But Xerxes, man, he goes. In fact, they're ready to set forth on this journey. And they had this. There was an eclipse, and somebody said that's a bad omen. You don't need to go because that's a sign that things are not going to go well. So Xerxes says, no, we're going to go. But there was this fellow there, this man who had been so kind, and he had hosted Xerxes and some of the troops, and he says, I think it is a bad sign. And so he didn't quite tell Xerxes that, but he says, hey, you asked me, did I want anything in return for being so kind to you and the troops? I have thought of one thing. I really don't want to grow. I'm getting older, and there's nobody here to help take care of me in my old age. So could you have my oldest son excused from the army for this mission? And it infuriated Xerxes because he realized that this fellow took that as a bad omen, and he doesn't believe in the victory now. And he says, yeah, I'm going to dismiss your son. He pulls him out from his ranks, severs his body in two. And he puts one side of the body on this side of the road and one side of the body on that side of the road as they march forward from that place. Tells you a little bit about his mindset and how temperamental he was. They came to the Hellespont, this body of water they got across to continue their journey, and they had to build a bridge across it, and the Hellespont kind of it was swelling up and even more difficult to cross at that point, which some people, again, being pagan, idolatrous people, again said, oh, this is a bad omen. But they build this bridge and they're almost done with it, and a storm comes and just wipes it out. And Xerxes was so furious, he executes the people that were over the project for building the bridge because, it was their fault, right? And also, for good measure, he had ordered some of his men to give lashes to the sea. for being so naughty, I guess. This is the kind of fellow you're dealing with, right? He goes and he comes, they had to come to this spot, and there's this narrow spot where the mountains come down right to the sea, and there's just a narrow pass. It's the pass of Thermopylae. And so this man named Leonidas with 300 men, kind of famous in history, right? If you've studied that much at all, you know what we're talking about. Leonidas and his 300 men. In fact, Xerxes was so confident in just the sheer number of troops, he sends a message to Leonidas, king of Sparta, and says, you can't win this, so let's make a deal. Surrender. Lay down your arms, and we'll be kind to you. And Leonidas' response was famous. He says, of course, in his language, but it translates to, come and get them. You want us to lay down our arms? Come and get them. He was known for his fierceness, Leonidas. He was a courageous soldier. And they held that pass against this massive force of Persian soldiers for a long time. And to a man, they died. Every single one. Spoiler alert. But he goes on, Xerxes does, with what's left of his forces. He's defeated at Salamis and basically ends up having to just turn around and come back. And they're eating like tree bark, seaweed, and stuff on the way back because they have no food left. There's no food in the lands that they're going through. He's like, in the South at least, we would say like he's running back like a dog with his tail between his legs. I mean, it was an utter failure, this attempt to invade and conquer Greece. All that to say, when you open up Esther chapter 1, we don't know with 100% certainty, but it seems this is not long after that. He finally returns home with just a skeleton crew of an army. He hardly had what could be, a lot of folks say it could hardly be considered an army at that point. And so he comes back, and a lot of historians tell us that Xerxes kind of gets, after that, it's almost like he's not really interested in government. He becomes obsessed with buildings and palaces and monuments and just, really not being much interested in military conquest and things like that. A little bit later on, he's going to try again with Greece, but it seems, again, I can't say it with 100% certainty, but it seems that's kind of the opening here of chapter 1 of Esther. And so he has this feast. And it's this big, glorious feast, and he wants his queen to come out. And again, Bible commentators are a little bit divided on this. It seems to me, and in fact, I've studied this. Some folks say that she did not, that she was the one in the wrong, Vashti, the queen. But anyway, he wants her to come out and everybody to see her beauty. She was fair to look upon. So here he's called for the queen. She refuses to come. Again, a lot of commentators think that the reason she refused is that what he's asking here is her to come out and be very immodest. Some commentators have even said that he's requiring her to come out wearing nothing but the crown. And say, everybody look at how beautiful my queen is. Well, Vashti, whatever the reason that she didn't come out, whatever the requirement was supposed to be, she also could be temperamental, and she could be cruel toward those who were under her as the queen. And so sometimes I sometimes will study this and I think, boy, isn't that great? She's such a good woman, but she certainly had her shortcomings as well. But on this occasion, at least, she refused. The king is upset. Kind of asked some advisors, what are we going to do about this? And they say to him, every other woman in the kingdom is going to start rebelling and refusing to do what they're supposed to do. You got to do something about this. So long story short, he basically divorces her, removes her from being queen. And he says, we're going to kind of have a contest, so to speak. We'll take a bunch of these young maidens and we'll see which one that the king likes. And of course, when you get into chapter 2, that's when you meet this young lady named Esther. The name means star. That's what Esther means. Her other name is Hadassah, which means myrtle. So who would have guessed, this lady named Myrtle or Star is going to become such a star in Scripture. You also find out that she has a cousin, Mordecai. Some people say Mordecai, and it depends on how it's inflected. Or I'll just say Mordecai because that's what I'm used to. But if I fall into saying it the other way, you'll know the same person. Mordecai was the great-grandson of a man named Kish. You remember Saul? Saul was the son of Kish, King Saul. This is a different Kish, obviously. But he was the great-grandson of a man named Kish who was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar with Jeconiah. There were 3 different times people were carried captive into Babylon. But we're talking about Esther and what we can learn from her, whatever my lot. Brother Tommy mentioned this, and his point well made, that there are times when you're just not going to be able to control what life throws at you. And you got to choose, am I going to just endure through this and keep at it? Or am I going to just kind of throw my hands up, give up, get angry at God, get angry at others? There are times when we just have to sort of roll with the punches. I was thinking about in Josh's lesson where he asked about a superhero that comes to mind. And one of the things that I was thinking about as he went on with that, especially talking about Paul and how you just couldn't beat this man, I'm thinking of not necessarily a superhero, but I grew up and I love watching the Rocky movies. One of the things about Rocky, was that he was, especially in the first movie, that's the one I think about the most. It wasn't necessarily my favorite of the series, but in a way it is, because in the first movie, you have a guy who is a mediocre boxer at best, right? He's not great, but he gets a shot at the championship to fight Apollo Creed, and so he's going to train. And there's one scene in the movie where he's talking to Adrian, and one of the things he says is nobody's ever gone 12 rounds with Apollo Creed. He's like, he doesn't even say, I want to win this thing. He says, I just want to go the distance. I want to go the distance with him. And that's basically his goal going into it. But, man, poor old Rocky just takes a beating in that fight. But he does. He goes the distance. Same thing when you get to 4 and he's fighting the Russian, and he's just taking the punches. And sometimes that's what you got to do in life. I mean, it feels like life is just beating you down. There are times when you can't control it. And that's what Esther finds herself dealing with, because they're going to have this, like I said, essentially a contest. We'll bring all these beautiful women and we'll just see who the king likes. Now imagine that. Here's a young lady. She's Jewish. She knows the true God of heaven. She, no doubt, is trying to keep herself pure for one day when she's going to be betrothed to and marry a good Jewish boy, and they're going to have a home together. And then somebody comes along and says, guess what? You're going to be in the king's harem. And a lot of times those women were used for just simply purely physical purposes by the king. Nothing she can do about that. She's got this cousin, Mordecai, and he's looked out for her. She's also an orphan. Her parents are dead. She's being raised, or has been raised, by her cousin. So that's another bad hand she's been dealt in life. Her parents are dead, and she's been brought up by her cousin. Goes on, and of course, I'm looking at Ahasuerus. Mordecai's sitting in the gate one day, and he hears these people, they're plotting against the king, and he goes and lets them know, and they do an investigation. They find out, sure enough, these guys were plotting against the king. And so those guys are taken and they're executed, as you can imagine, when you're plotting against the king. And they write it down in the chronicles that, hey, good job, Mordecai. He saved the king here from harm. And it's kind of forgotten about after that. But then there's this fella Haman, and he comes along, and he's the king likes him, and he's promoted. And Haman is so full of himself. And these people, they just, they kind of just, they fall all over themselves to talk about Haman and how wonderful he is. And except for one guy, Mordecai. And Mordecai's not being ugly. It's not that he was a jerk to Haman or anything like that. He just doesn't bow down to him. And it just, it eats him up. Haman can't stand that. He wants to do something about it. And so he's just so upset. And of course he goes and he talks to the king. He's got the ear of the king, and he says, hey, there's these people, and they don't follow the king's laws. They're bad for the kingdom. And so I think we need to just exterminate them. And Xerxes, again, remember who Xerxes is. He's kind of temperamental. You see that when he just says in his drunken stupor, bring my wife out here. And then when she refuses, we're just going to kick her out from being queen. Well, now he says, oh, yeah, you want to exterminate a whole race of people? Sure, why not? I don't care. And he agrees to this. Of course, he doesn't know Esther is a Jew. So Haman gets this. And by the way, one of the things that you learn about the Medes and the Persians, particularly the Persian Empire now, when something is signed into law, even the king has to abide by it, right? You see that, Daniel chapter 6. Daniel's set within the reign, at least that part of Daniel is set within the reign of the Persian Empire. And they say, well, if anybody prays to anyone but you, king, for 30 days, he's going to be thrown into a lion's den. King says, okay, signs it. And then they come and they say, oh, guess what? Daniel's been praying to somebody. Well, the king loved Daniel. And in fact, the text in Daniel 6 tells us he tried to get Daniel out of that punishment. And they said, no, king, you signed it. And he realized then how stupid he'd been, how foolish he'd been. Well, Ahasuerus signs this into law. So on a set day, they can kill all the Jews. Mordecai finds out about this. He is, as you can imagine, he's upset. He goes, talks to Esther, says, you got to do something. Esther says, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. You can't just walk in and see the king. Again, temperamental Xerxes, right? You don't just walk in and say, hey, can I have a moment? Doesn't work that way. He calls for you. And if you go in and he doesn't extend the scepter, which says you're okay, he doesn't do that, they kill you. You said, man, that sounds extreme. Well, did you listen to what we said about Xerxes? He's pretty extreme. That was Xerxes. Well, Esther decides she's going to do that. So she goes in, he extends the scepter. He says, what do you want, Esther? She says, I want to have a dinner party, a dinner feast. Okay. And she says, I want you and Haman to come. And can't you just see Haman? I mean, Haman's probably like, oh, wow, that's something else. And maybe Haman went home and told his wives that, listen, we're going to have a dinner feast. And the queen, has invited the king and me. It's just us. I mean, this is great. So they have a feast, and then she says, I want to have another night where we do this dinner thing again. And Haman goes home, and I mean, he is just beside himself, happy. And he says, this is, I mean, it just couldn't get any better. There's just one nagging thing, and it's that Mordecai, that Jew. He will not show me any kind of reverence or respect, and I can't stand him. And none of this means anything as long as he's alive. And his wife says, well, build yourself a gallows, and you could just hang him on it. When the time comes to exterminate all those Jews, you can just personally take care of him yourself. And he says, you know what? That's a great idea. So he builds a big old gallows. I mean, 75 feet high. He wants to make a big spectacle of this thing. Well, then there was a night the king, he can't sleep, right? And so they, what do you do when you can't sleep? Besides putting on, your preacher sermons, right? You bring people. One of our members actually at Bremen told me that one time. She said, and she didn't mean it that way, but it was funny the way she said it. She said, the other night I was listening to one of your sermons. It was just so wonderful. And then I fell asleep. She said, I listen to your sermons a lot at night when I'm getting ready to go to sleep. And I said, thank you. But if you're having trouble sleeping and you're not a huge person that's big into history, I happen to be. I could read history and not go to sleep. But, history, a lot of times it'll put us to sleep sometimes. So here's Xerxes having trouble sleeping. So he brings in the historical chronicles and they begin to read. And you know what they ran across? They ran across this time when two people were plotting against the king, and a man named Mordecai overheard it and told the king about it. And they investigated, and sure enough, they were trying to harm the king. And so they were executed. And he says, what was ever done for that guy? Well, they get to look at nothing. We gotta do something to honor this guy. I mean, he saved the king's life. And about that time, Mordecai comes in. He wants to talk to him about, Haman comes in, sorry. He wants to talk to Xerxes about killing Mordecai. So he says, bring him on. Come on in, Haman. Listen, Haman, I know you got something you want here, but first, what do you think should be done for the guy that the king wants to honor? and you know what happens here? Haman is thinking, well, who else could he want to honor but me? And so he's got all these things that are going to be done, and put this special garment on him and all this stuff, and ride him through the street on the king's horse, and have announced, this is what's done for the person in whom the king delights. I think that would be great, King. And no doubt Haman, sorry, you had to yell at me if I use the wrong name, because sometimes I do this when I'm talking about Esther, and I get, for some reason, Haman and Mordecai just reverse when I'm talking about them. But if I do it, somebody just, wave at me or something, and I'll correct it. So can't you just imagine Haman in his mind's eye? He's picturing him riding through the street, and all the people are like, wow, isn't that amazing? Look at that Haman, how the king delights in him. And so he tells the king, that's what I would do for the person in whom the king delights. Yes, I think that sounds excellent. And about that time, Xerxes says, what? That sounds great. Now do all of that you just said for Mordecai. Man, can you imagine? I can't even imagine. He probably got red in the face. He was so angry. And he probably had to leave pretty quickly before the king's like, what's wrong with you? And so he had to go and do all that, right? And probably the one consolation in his mind is that, well, in just a little bit, I got it signed into law, so I'm at least going to get to exterminate this guy. I'll at least have that little bit to look forward to. Meanwhile, Esther has her dinner with the king. She says, he still hasn't heard what her request is. She says, well, there's an evil man who's plotting to get rid of me and my people. Well, of course, he loves Esther, you recall, more than anybody else. He says, who would do that? Who would do such a thing? Well, see, she's got Haman at the dinner with her, and she says, it's Haman. And he gets up, the king does. He goes outside. And Haman is kind of in panic mode, right? And he goes kind of just falling down like, please, he's going to beg for mercy or whatever. Well, the king walks back in about that time, and he's thinking, is he going to try to force himself upon her right here even? And he says, take him out right then. And they take Haman out. They hang him on the gallows, on his own gallows. You reap what you sow, don't you? And of course, summing up very quickly the last little bit of the book, the king says, well, I can't change the law. It's been signed into law. But I tell you what we will do. We'll kind of write an amendment here, an addendum to the law that says, okay, on this set day, anybody can exterminate the Jews, but they can also defend themselves. So they did, and the Jews, of course, survived. But what an amazing account of God's providence working in so many different ways. And, you see this with Joseph as well. You see it sometimes in the life of Paul. But with a key word with providence, we did a study on providence, I don't know, it's been a few years ago at Bremen. And the word that you always come back to with providence is perhaps. Paul says that in the book of Philemon. Perhaps he departed from thee for a season, talking about Onesimus, that runaway slave. Perhaps he departed for a season that you might gain him back forever, not just as a servant, but as a brother. So there are many times in the book of Esther when you say perhaps. Did it just so happen that this was happening? Did it just so happen that Xerxes can't sleep one night and they bring in the Chronicles and he hears about and reads about this man who saved the king's life and goes, wait a minute, did anybody ever do anything to honor this guy? There's just so many things here. But I want to look at just a few things with Esther that whatever your lot, You may be in really good times right now and things are going well. And it's one of the things about, especially some of you, as you get into teenage years, there's something about childhood and that's really the way it's supposed to be. It's a shame when younger children have to deal with a lot of major issues in life, because really the way the Lord designed it, when we're growing up and we're younger children, we shouldn't have a care in the world. Because mom and dad are taking care of things and they look after things. And if it's not mom and dad, maybe it's grandma and grandpa, or whoever it may be that's looking out after us. In Esther's case, it was her cousin Mordecai. And we're not supposed to have a care in the world, but as you start to get to a certain age, and it kind of hit me at 16, because my out of nowhere event was my grandmother that I was so close to on my mom's side. She died very suddenly, and all of a sudden you realize life's not always just okay. And there are things that happen that are not easy. And sometimes it comes a little earlier in life, sometimes a little bit later. But that was kind of the aha moment for me. And those are moments in life that you'll look back in adulthood and you'll look and say, okay, I either really grew a lot maturity wise and maybe even spiritually wise, or I went backward a lot maturity wise or spiritually. And you got to make a choice there. And I love what Tommy said. It's not about God seeing how much faith we got. He knows. But it's about me seeing the areas I need to grow and I need to work on, and making that decision to do that. But here's a young lady that she was submissive. And I tell you something, you can be in good times, you can be in terrible times, but you can be submissive to the will of God. You can be obedient. You look at chapter 2 specifically here in the book of Esther, and this young lady, she's obedient and submissive. She had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, verse 20 of chapter 2, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. She obeyed him like a parent, even after she became queen. She didn't say, let me tell you something, Mordecai. You're going to do what I say now, because I'm the queen. No. She was submissive and obedient. And, she was going right with that. She was humble. Even as the queen, she's not too important in her own eyes to listen to Mordecai. She listened to him. Should we be submissive? You know the verses, Ephesians 6:1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. We need to be submissive to parents. We also need to be submissive to one another. That's what Paul says in Ephesians 5:21. Submitting yourselves to one another in the fear of God. In fact, look at 1 Peter 5. There's a verse here in 1 Peter 5 that deals with this. He says, talking about the younger, and this could be younger, anybody. But he says, you younger, submit yourselves unto the elders. And that's not talking about the elders in the church. As far as in the congregation, we should be in submission to them. But he's just saying, younger, submit yourself to the elder. And then he says, yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. Well, here's a young lady that she was obedient, she was submissive, and it was from her humility. Of course, Jesus is the ultimate example of humility. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek, lowly in heart. You shall find rest to your souls. Matthew 11:28 and 29. Jesus was so meek and humble, and we saw that in 1 Peter 5. He says to be clothed with humility. That's the idea of putting on humility as a garment. Well, what's the song we sing from James 4:10? Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. Esther humbled herself. Even as queen, she didn't get cocky about that. She didn't get prideful or arrogant about that. And you know what? God lifted her up. Even in her childhood, she was humble. God lifted her up to the position of being queen. And that revealed her character. Sometimes trials reveal our characters. But let me tell you something, folks. And I've learned this a couple times the hard way, dealing with other people. I tell you something that'll reveal a person's character as much or more so than hardship is success. Let them be promoted, let them be blessed, and let them be recognized. And all of a sudden, sometimes a person that seems pretty nice, easygoing, humble, gets really lifted up with pride, but not Esther. I'll tell you something else about Esther. She listened to good advice. Is there ever a time when you need good advice? You better believe it. Chapter 2, verse 10, she listened to Mordecai when he told her not to tell who her people were. When you get to chapter 4, he's telling her, he's kind of counseling her on what to do in that situation. And it's a good thing she listened because his advice was good. He says, you got to use your position as queen. You can help us out. We'll look at a couple of verses from Proverbs. There's so many here that we could mention, but I want to look at Proverbs 12:15 came to my mind, where he says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. If you want to be wise, you need to learn sometimes there's good advice. It may not be necessarily what I want to hear. 1 Kings 12. That'd be 2 Kings 12, wouldn't it? No, 1 Kings 12. A man named Rehoboam, he got some advice, and it wasn't the advice he wanted to hear, so he went and got some more advice, and that was the advice he wanted to hear, and he listened to it. So listen to me, pay attention when I say good advice. You need to make sure you take good advice. He that hearkeneth to counsel is wise. Proverbs 11, verse 14. Where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. And Proverbs 23:9 tells us a fool despises wisdom. This lady, she was wise, Esther. And even in a difficult situation, even when times were good, you see both in Esther, by the way. You see sometimes for her, it's the best of times, and sometimes it's the worst of times. But either way, she's willing to listen to sound advice or counsel. And you and I, if we're going to be pleasing to God, if we're going to put God first, there are times when you need to be willing to listen to good advice, even though it may not be what you want to hear at the time. What about Esther? Was she selfless? She certainly was selfless, was she not? She could have lost her life approaching the king uninvited. In fact, that was her first reaction when Mordecai told her that. She says, you know what the rule is. I could be killed for this. And Mordecai kind of says, it's what's got to be done. There are times when we need to be thinking about others. And that's the mind of Christ, right? Philippians 2:5-8. Particularly, really back up to about verse 3. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Be selfless is what Paul is saying there. Think about others before thinking of self. And man, did Esther not do that? I mean, she could have said, look, you guys are on your own because I'm not taking that chance with my own life. And she could have even rationalized, what good am I? If I go in there and get killed, I can't help you that way. But now, no excuses. She's gonna go in and put her life on the line and help her people. And then finally, I'll tell you something about Esther, and this is something that we all can do, whether good times or bad. She did what she could with what she had. In Exodus 4:2, Moses is making all those excuses why he can't go and lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. And one of the things that God says to him in that context is, what is that in thine hand? Well, what's in your hand, Moses? Well, it's a rod. Throw it on the ground, becomes a serpent. Pick it up, becomes a rod again. And old-timey preachers have preached many sermons from that one little statement. What do you have in your hand? Do what you can with what you have. Esther could not call 10,000 angels. We sometimes sing the song about Jesus. Jesus, he could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. Could Esther? No. She couldn't do it. Could Esther have snapped her fingers and called her army and put them into action and said, hey, save my people? Well, no, she didn't have an army at her command. Could she have performed a miracle to save her people? No. No indication she could have done that at all. But again, going back to chapter 2, verse 17, the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the other ones. He puts the crown upon her head, makes her queen instead of Vashti. What did she have in her hand? She had the love of the king. And she knew she could use that influence. She didn't have an army, didn't have miraculous ability. She used what she had. She persevered. She didn't ask to be in this situation, but she's going to make the best of it and use it to help her people. And you know what? She took action. Listen to me carefully. There are times when you simply must take action. There are times we don't want trouble. We don't want confrontation. We don't want conflict, but there are times when you have to take action. I love what Mordecai says in verses 13 and 14 of chapter 4. He sends word to Esther. Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. He loves her, and he's shown his love for her throughout her life, no doubt. But he gets kind of stern with her here, and he says, let me tell you something, Esther. Don't think you're going to survive. Even if everybody else, if you don't do anything and the rest of the Jews perish, don't think you're going to survive this, because you'll be punished too. Verse 14, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. Listen, God's got a promise to keep, a promise to Abraham. In thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Mordecai knows his scripture. He knows God's sending the Messiah. He's not going to wipe out he won't permit the entire Jewish race to be wiped out there in that context. But he says, you and your father's house will be destroyed. And then you go on to the rest of that verse, and he says, and who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Perhaps, there's our word for providence, right? Perhaps you came to the kingdom for just this reason, Esther, and you're going to just sit there and do nothing? And she says, no, I'm going to do what I can with what I have. Oh man, God uses different people in different ways. Read 1 Corinthians 12 sometime. You'll see all the different functions in the body of Christ, and different people, different talents, different abilities, different functions within the body of Christ. Shamgar, he took an ox goad and he took out 600 men. Samson was the jawbone of a donkey. Think about Gideon with just his 300 men. Dorcas, some sewing thread and a needle, and look at the good she did for the Lord's church. Dorcas, or Tabitha, there in Acts chapter 9. Whether peace like a river or sorrow like sea billows, listen to me carefully. Whether it's good times or bad times, you and I, we can be submissive, obedient people in our hearts. It's people that want to serve the Lord. We can be open to good advice, good counsel, sound counsel. We can be people who are humble, meek. We can be selfless people who are serving others, looking for opportunities to serve others. And we can do what we can with what we've got. You don't have the same talents, abilities, opportunities that I do. I don't have the same talents, abilities, and opportunities that you do. But we can do what we can with what we have. In the end, Esther is a great, great example of Galatians 6, 7, and 8. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. He that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Again, go back to the words of David. David says, I've been young, now I'm old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. Good times or bad, you stay faithful to the Lord. And his promise is, as we sometimes sing in the song, look ever to Jesus. He will carry you through. The book of Revelation promises victory for the forces of Jesus Christ. Let's make sure we're on his side, and whatever my lot, I can say it is well with my soul. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you, Scott, for a great day you put together here.
Thank you, brother. We've had 3 amazing speakers, 3 amazing lessons. What can we glean from today? Did Joseph choose to undergo the things he went through? No. Did Joseph choose to be betrayed? Did Joseph choose to be in his condition at all? Absolutely not. Did Esther choose to be summoned by the king and to be put in her position? Absolutely not. Did they choose to endure what happened to them? Did Paul make the choice to be shipwrecked, stoned, and beaten? Absolutely not. But Paul summed it up very well. He said that he has learned. I thought you were going to steal my candy. That he's learned that he can do all things through Christ, which strengthens him, right? He's learned to endure all things through Christ. Did you have enough interest to have prizes, Victoria? Or? For shame. Y'all better tell Victoria thank you for the cookies at the very least. We're going to sing 2 more songs before we dismiss, and Joe has our closing prayer. Heaven's Medley, and then the Greatest Command. I really appreciate you holding on to it and being responsible and making sure you throw your trash away. As I would appreciate from everyone, make sure that you get your trash and throw it away on the way out. All right, sopranos on the Saints, altos on the sing, tenors heaven's on the place, bass swing low, sweet chariot. There's only like 2 people that sing tenor bass, so sing loud. Remember, we're going to build up, and then we're going to get back down and about join in and get at the end.
Oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, how I want to be in that number, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the saints sing, I'm to shout, 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 I'm to sing, I'm to shout, praise the Lord. When my saints are open wide, I'm to sit at Jesus' side. I'm to sing, I'm to shout, praise the Lord. I'm to sing, 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 I'm to shout, shout, shout. I'm to sing, I'm to shout, praise the Lord. I'm the saints open wide, I'm to sit at Jesus' side. I'm to sing, I'm to shout, praise the Lord. Sing, 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 I'm to shout, shout, shout. I'm to sing, I'm to shout, praise the Lord. I'm the saints are open wide, I'm to sit at Jesus' side. I'm to sing, I'm to shout, praise the Lord. Heaven is a wonderful place. I'm gonna sing with glory and praise. When the saints are on the scene, I'm gonna sit at your side. I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna shout, praise the Lord. I'm gonna sing, sing, sing. I'm gonna shout, shout, shout. I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna shout, praise the Lord. When those gates are open wide, I'm gonna sit at Jesus' side. I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna shout, praise the Lord. Oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, how I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in, I'm the saints, marching, shout, shout, shout. I'm the saints, I'm the shout, praise the Lord. When the gates are open wide, I'm gonna sit at Jesus' side. I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna shout, praise the Lord.
Next year, we'll kick that one out because we don't have enough parts to support that. So, next year, our speaker is Lonnie Jones, which we're excited to say. Our theme is still being decided, but thinking something about the Christian walk and walking the Christian walk with Brother Lonnie Jones. So that'll be exciting. We'll be pushing that out, getting advertised, all fun stuff. Should have our lovely Faulkner rep back next year as well. So make sure y'all talk to her. Once again, thank you for the cookies. Make sure I'm not missing anything. To my people that were my helpers today, thank you so much. Couldn't have done it without you. If you did help today, firstly, let's make sure that we're ready to go before we leave, clean up and whatnot. Secondly, if you did stay and help today, then tomorrow after services, invite you to stay for lunch. Spoiler alert, it's leftovers. But anyway, it'll be free. So, anyway, bonus. That's all I can think of. Thank y'all again for coming out. Appreciate y'all greatly. Victoria, thank you for getting Faulkner out here. This big closure worked great.
If you'll bow with me. Father God, we come to you today so very thankful for the chance we've had to come together like this in such a strange time in our country. We're thankful for the freedoms that we have in the country that we live in. We're thankful for the speakers who have spent time, just hours of their life dedicated to you to learn your word, that they can teach it, that we can understand. We ask you to be with us as we go about our days, that we would take these words that we've learned, that we'd take the lessons and we'd apply them to our lives. We'd take this understanding and be a great example of the Christian you would have us be. Be with us as we go about our lives, that we would shine as the city on a hill, that we would influence others with your word and your word alone, untainted by our opinions. Forgive us when we falter, Father. Be with us until we gather again. These things we pray in your Son's most holy name. Amen.